Okay, everybody, welcome, students. So this week we are going to focus on two very great, significant jazz legends. One of them being Jelly Roll Morton, who, as an early jazz artist, he established a lot of the norms that spread through jazz for decades. And of course, Louis Armstrong, who is probably the single greatest figure in jazz. So we'll start with Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton is an early figure in jazz. He was a New Orleans pianist, and he was Creole. Again, Creole is with that culture in New Orleans that were half European and half black. So maybe they had a father or mother that was European, Spanish or French. In New Orleans, there were a lot of French Creoles. So Jello Morton was a Creole, and he is known in history as being the first jazz pianist. He took out these ragtime rhythms and smoothed them. And all this new music that was occurring in New Orleans, all these new jazz rhythms, he put it into his piano music. So he kind of transitioned out of ragtime piano into a jazz piano with these New Orleans jazz rhythms. Jelly Roll Morton is the first jazz composer. He was the first guy to actually write his own tunes and to not only compose them, but to write them out and to publish them. And his compositions have become standards of traditional jazz. And a lot of things he came up at the time with various riffs and various kind of rhythms found their way into the swing music of the 30s. Now, if Jelly Roll Morton was the first jazz composer, well, what were bands playing before? They were just playing stuff that had already been out there: marches, ragtime tunes, spirituals, blues, just stuff. But nobody had ever decided, I am going to write something down. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to give it sections. I'm really going to make it a composition. So Jelly Roll Morton is the first jazz composer. Jelly Roll Morton introduced arranging concepts to jazz. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the 1920s, he put together a band called the Red Hot Peppers. It was one of the great jazz bands of the 1920s, and it was solely a studio band. He just got the best New Orleans musicians. He gathered them into the New York recording studios that were recording jazz at the time. And what he said, I have composed my own pieces, and I want them to be done this way. So the thing is, before Morton came along, the concept of jazz was everybody just we're just going to jam. We're just going to jam, and everybody's going to play and for 3 minutes, and that's the tune. Well, Jelly Roll Morton in these band recordings is very specific about what he wants in terms of who's going to solo when, how we're going to split solos up, breaks, nice, interesting background. So again, he was the first composer to decide that if we have a group thing going on, we can actually do other things besides just having a full-on jam session. While I'm thinking about it, the question has often been asked about where does Jelly Roll's nickname come from. He was obviously not born with that name. That's a nickname he gave himself. And without giving too much, it is definitely a term of sexual connotation, and we'll just leave it at that. Jelly Roll led a fascinating life, and you'll see from the videos, how fascinating it was. Now we get to Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is hands down the single greatest contributor to jazz. If Louis Armstrong had never existed, jazz would not be what it now is, and it would be something different. It would probably not have become the art form it became, and by extension, jazz, as it really came to the forefront in the 1920s and 1930s, influenced so much of music, not only American, but throughout the world. And it can be said that because Louis Armstrong is the single greatest contributor to jazz, by extension, he changed the way music was done moving forward for the modern era. Louis Armstrong was a virtuoso trumpet player. Uh, he was a genius. He was self-taught. He was born in New Orleans, very poor. He didn't have a chance, but he just had a God-given talent. And when he came on the scene, he really raised the bar for not only all trumpet players, but he raised the bar for all musicians, and especially jazz musicians, because up to that time, jazz musicians were kind of seen as an illiterate lot in the sense that they didn't read music, they were very raw, they just kind of played by ear, they just kind of really didn't know what they were doing. But Louis Armstrong came along, and all of a sudden, every single musician, didn't matter whether they were trumpet or pianist or clarinet, it didn't matter. They now had to reach a much higher standard of musicianship. Armstrong made jazz a solo art form. When you start listening to these recordings and you compare them to the original Dixieland Jazz Band or the King Oliver Creole Jazz Band or even the Morton recordings, Louis Armstrong, with his recordings during the 1920s, the Hot 5 and Hot 7, he's the one that established jazz as a solo art form. How did he do that? Well, he was such a virtuoso and a star that people started to give him more space and said, let Louis play. He's amazing. And all of a sudden, jazz took a turn where the music was now going to really focus on an artist individual improvisational expression. Louis made jazz a solo art form. Louis Armstrong introduced the rhythmic concept of swing to jazz. This indefinable feel, this indefinable rhythmic feel that before Louis Armstrong recordings, the music had drive, it had energy, but it was still kind of, I'll say, ragtime stiff, a lot of kind of thing. But Louis totally changed the approach to playing jazz. So for the rest of time, once Louis came on the scene, everybody had to start swinging, and the music took on that rhythmic feel. Louis wasn't just a great jazz trumpet player. He was also a great singer. He introduced scat singing, the idea of using nonsense syllables in vocalization. Doo-wop, 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 shidop, dee-ba-doo-bop. And he revolutionized pop singing, because even when he just sang melodies, he sang the tunes the way he wanted to sing the tunes. Before Louis Armstrong came along and a singer did a recording, they sang it exactly the way the person had written it out. Louis Armstrong took so much liberties with it and said, I'm going to, feel the tempo this way. I might want to change the melody this way. All of a sudden, every single pop singer after Louis Armstrong, from the 20s all the way up to, modern times, every single singer takes the tune and sings it their way, the way they feel like singing it. So Louis Armstrong, it revolutionized pop singing. Now, Louis Armstrong had three stages of his career. In his early stage, as a young man during the 1920s, he made these recordings with his band called the Hot 5, later the Hot 7, and they broke away from the New Orleans collective improvisation and started focusing on the soloist. And West End Blues, which you'll hear in your ebook, it is one of the recordings that marked the new direction of jazz. And you can hear also from the video assignments I put up how Louis Armstrong's virtuosity shows the way that is now a solo art form. In the middle stage of Armstrong's career, he was such a great trumpet player and great recording artist that he became a popular entertainer during the 1930s and 40s. And Armstrong helped break down color barriers. He appeared on Broadway, movies, radio. He was everywhere. And all consumers, black and white, loved Louis Armstrong. They loved his music, and he really paved the way for a lot of other black artists coming up through these pretty segregationist times. And in the late career, Armstrong was known as Ambassador Satch. And in the 1960s and 1970s, he toured the world playing jazz, presenting it to, he played in places nobody had ever played jazz before. And he was quite the beloved figure. And even today, Louis Armstrong's recordings and videos, they stand the test of time. They're really inspiration for a lot of people. So Armstrong, even today, is still celebrated and influential. And the thing is, the Time magazine once called Armstrong, this was back around the turn of the century, 2000, they said that he was one of the, out of 100 people, one of the most influential people of the past 2,000 years. Definitely a great artist and great humanitarian. So hopefully you enjoyed listening to Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton this week. Have a wonderful week.